Okay. All right, everyone, please take your seats, and we'll get going here. I'm going to dip back into history again here with Tom Jefferson. I'm going to count Thomas as one of my best friends here and colleagues. It's so wonderful to have you here, Tom. Tom has been, I think most of you will know Tom Jefferson, but just in case you don't, Tom Jefferson has been studying marine mammals since 1983 when he was an undergraduate student. His main interests were developing marine mammal identification aids, and there's been a lot of ID guides since then that have been produced and published and written by him. And the systematics and population ecology of more poorly understood, poorly known species of dolphins and porpoises. Essentially, all of his work has been related to conservation and management of marine mammals threatened by human activities. And this current primary research focuses on the conservation biology of humpback dolphins, the Sousa genus, and Finnus porpoises, Neophacina, and populations. In addition, he is involved in many other projects, including those of the conservation and critically endangered vaquita, Cetacean. In 2015, with the co-authors of Mark Webber and Bob Pittman, he published a comprehensive identification guide to marine mammals of the world. It's an Elsevier academic press. You can find it there on Amazon. Wonderful book, if I don't say so myself. He's authored over 190 books, papers on marine mammals, and recently published his revising the taxonomy of humpback dolphins and describing new species, the Sousa suhalensis, the Australian humpback dolphin. And most recently, actually, the whole nomenclature overview and starting on the small Adonisids. You will talk a little bit more about that. Taxonomy. So this Tom's talk is titled "How can something so boring can be so fascinating?" And I think it is. The history of cetacean taxonomy and nomenclature. Yeah, Herman Melville already called them the constituents of chaos. About 100 years earlier, Linnaeus already took the whales and dolphins and porpoises out of this sort of fishy realm into a new category, mammals, which included us. But that didn't mean that there were still a lot of things unresolved, and Tom will tell a little bit more about that history and also about the importance of taxonomy. We can kind of, for us, we see this Latin stuff and doesn't make sense, but it's important for conservation efforts and under our understanding of whales and dolphins. And I'll stop talking, and I'm going to take this over to Tom Jefferson.
Thank you, Uko. Can you hear me okay? Good morning, everybody. Before I get started, I would like to dedicate this talk to the memory of Bill Perrin, who unfortunately passed away this past summer. I'm sure probably just about all of you know Bill Perrin's incredible legacy in this field of marine mammalogy. A few of you might be saying, who was Bill Perrin? And maybe you were living in a cave for the past 50 years or so, or had nothing to do with marine mammals until yesterday. And if you didn't know who Bill Perrin was, let me just tell you a little bit about him. He was a Southwest Fisheries Science Center marine mammal biologist extraordinaire and a senior scientist at that center of NOAA for many, many years. He was the discoverer of the tuna dolphin issue. So basically, before Bill, nobody except for a few fishermen really knew about the tuna dolphin issue. And of course, that was a major impetus in the creation of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. He was the undisputed father of marine mammal taxonomy, modern marine mammal taxonomy, and the world's expert on the genus Stenella, which is the spotted spinner and striped dolphins. He was the third president of the Marine Mammal Society, the Society for Marine Mammalogy, and an editor for many years of the journal Marine Mammal Science. He served in many different roles in the International Whaling Commission, the Marine Mammal Commission, IUCN Cetacean Specialist Group, Convention for Migratory Species, and many, many others. He published more than 325 papers and books on marine mammals. I'm sure many of you have many of those papers and books in your libraries. And he retired from NOAA in 2013 after almost 5 decades of federal service. And besides these amazing accomplishments that might go on a CV, Bill was something else as well. Despite having sort of a bit of a gruff exterior, which I'm sure any of you who knew Bill probably recognized, he was actually an amazingly helpful and generous guy. And he played an amazing role in helping so many people, myself included, get started in the marine mammal field over the years that he was a biologist at NOAA. And I know so many people probably in this room and many, many others in the field of marine mammalogy owe a great debt of gratitude to Bill for his generosity in helping people get started and for all of the contributions that he made to our field. So I'd like to dedicate this talk to him. The microphone seems to be going in and out. Is this microphone the one that I'm using, or is it the microphone on my lapel? I'm not sure which one is coming through. Lapel? Okay. So I'm not going to bother with this one. Yeah, okay. Okay. Is it okay now? Okay. So, moving on. The title of my talk, as Uko said, is about marine mammal taxonomy and nomenclature. And my goal today is to try to convince you that this isn't the most boring thing in the field of marine mammalogy, which is probably what a lot of you are thinking, but actually can be pretty interesting and fascinating. And it's an area that only a few people in the field really delve into much. It's not something that really involves a lot of the major gee-whiz technology like the drone footage we saw last night. It doesn't involve getting beautiful videos of beaked whales leaping out of the water. This thing is still going in and out, and I'm not sure exactly why. Sorry? Is it? Okay, now it's okay again. Yeah. Is it not too far? Sorry? Okay. Is that better? Let me just take this off. Sorry about the scrunching sounds. Okay, is that better? Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to try to convince you that marine mammal taxonomy and nomenclature are actually somewhat interesting. So first of all, an outline of my talk. I'm going to talk about the importance of taxonomy, why it's an important thing. A little terminology, which is basically talking about taxonomy versus systematics versus nomenclature. A little bit about the basics of zoological taxonomy. A little bit of the history of how we got where we are today. Some of the people and interesting personalities that are involved in the history of marine mammal taxonomy and nomenclature. I'll tell you about some of the recent clarifications and revisions of taxonomy that have happened in the last couple of years. Some important changes on the horizon that are going to be happening in the next couple of years down the road. So, and finally, some concluding remarks. And then, if you're all still awake at that point, it'll be good because I'm going to have a riddle at the end. So make sure you've got your thinking caps out and available because I've got a really challenging cetacean riddle for you that we'll see whether anybody can get. Okay. So moving on to the importance of taxonomy. So taxonomy is important, and if you don't believe me, let me give you a couple of reasons. It represents the most basic element of our understanding of biology. And I think we can all sort of appreciate that the recognition and the naming of different organisms is really important to our understanding of those animals, not just in science, but in society in general. It's important to scientists because we need to be able to clearly talk to each other about what we're studying. And obviously, if you write a paper on a species of marine mammal, you need to make sure you're clear with your audience about what you're talking about, and everybody has a common understanding of that. It's important to the public, Democrats and Republicans, because everyone, I think, sees the need to recognize and name species of animals. So even if you're not really interested in science very much or conservation, if you have a yard and you have birds in your yard, you might be interested in knowing what kind of bird is flying around in your garden. So I think it's something that almost universally people, even people who live in cities, have an understanding and a need for an understanding of taxonomy. Taxonomy is important to conservation because it forms the basis of our endangered species list. And I think that's pretty important. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. An incorrect taxonomy can cause big problems for protection of the animals because we need to know what it is we're trying to protect, and we need to know where the boundaries are for the different types of taxa that we're trying to protect. So a little bit about endangered species lists. There are many different ones used around the world, but the two most prominent ones probably for us in this room are the IUCN Red List, which is an international list of endangered species, and the U.S. Endangered Species List, which is specific to the United States, but again, since we're here in the U.S., it's a pretty important one for us here in this country. And these lists are used to guide conservation actions by countries and international bodies, and of course have an influence on all of us who interact with the animals. So the IUCN Red List has 8 major categories that describe species level of endangerment, ranging from data deficient, which means we don't really know enough about them, to extinct. And then the U.S. Endangered Species Act has 2 main categories, threatened and endangered, and other species that are not listed are just considered not listed on the Endangered Species Act. And these are all designed to provide a standardized way of ranking the risk of extinction for different species, and even subspecies and populations. So another important thing about taxonomy is that it reflects evolution. Because taxonomy, or because species are based on phylogenetic relationships, taxonomy tells us something about their evolutionary history. For instance, bats are classified with mammals, even though they have wings and fly, and not with birds, because of a shared common ancestry. That recognition was not always the case, and it's true that back in the old days, cetaceans were classified with fish because, many, many centuries ago, millennia ago, people saw whales and dolphins as these slippery animals that lived in the ocean with fins, and they didn't recognize that they were actually just a specialized group of mammals, but they thought they were a weird kind of fish. We know much better now. So a little bit about the taxonomy, the nomenclature and taxonomy of taxonomy. Some terminology here that's important to recognize. Taxonomy refers to the description, classification, and naming of organisms, and we owe this to Carl Linnaeus, who Uko mentioned earlier, for our system of binomial nomenclature. Nomenclature specifically refers to the naming of organisms, and it's that particular part of taxonomy that involves the naming of organisms and all the rules that go into deciding what the correct name of an organism is going to be. And systematics, which is something I won't really talk that much about in this presentation, but it's important to recognize, is the arrangement of taxonomic groups into ever higher classifications. A little bit more terminology before we move on. A valid species that's probably a term you've heard before. A valid species means a species that's currently recognized as a legitimate species in its own right, okay? Many species that have been described in the past are not recognized anymore as valid species, and most of those are recognized as what we call junior synonyms. They're basically a name that was given by somebody in the past, but it's now known to be a subset of another recognized species that doesn't use that name. And homonyms are names that are basically the same name that's used for two different species. And finally, an available name is a name that needs to be taken into account in nomenclature, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an actual valid species. So many of these available names are what are called junior synonyms, which I mentioned before. You probably heard about a type specimen, and some of you may not know exactly what this refers to. A type specimen is basically a specimen that acts as sort of a nomenclature anchor, a nomenclatorial bearer of the species name. And if there's a single type specimen, it's considered to be a holotype, but in some cases there is a series of type specimens, so it just really depends on when that species was recognized. And usually in cetaceans, type specimens are skulls, like the skull of a strap-toothed beaked whale, but it really can be any part of the body and even genetic material, things like that. It's just something that is some kind of a physical characteristic or a specimen that is the taxonomic name bearer for that species. That's really its only determination. So a little bit about taxonomic nomenclature. It's governed by this book called the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature, which is pretty boring to read if you ever go through and read it. It's kind of like reading a phone book, so I wouldn't recommend it, but it's very important. And it's based on a couple of important principles. The principle of priority is that all else being equal, the earliest name, if there's multiple names that have been given to a particular species, the earliest name that's available is the one that we should be using to call that species. And another important object of the code, as it's called, is stability. And that means that although we want to use the earliest possible name for each species, it's also important to recognize that in some cases, switching names to an earlier name that might have priority can cause confusion. And so it's important to recognize that the code also acts to try to maintain stability. So we don't want to switch out a name that we've been using for 100 years or more just so they're having the correct technical name in place. And sometimes these goals are in conflict. So sometimes we have a situation where we have to decide whether to favor stability or priority. And I'll give an example of that in a moment. So this code of zoological nomenclature uses wording that I call nominese, or nominese, something like lawyerese, if you've heard about that. And this can be pretty difficult to decipher. So if you look at this description in the zoological code, I'll just read a little bit of it here. Article 2312, names rejected under former Article 23B, a name that was rejected between 6 November 1961 and 1 January 1973, blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to read the rest of it because I don't want to put you to sleep. But that's what a lot of the wording in the code sounds like. And I'll admit, that part is pretty darn boring. I sometimes read through that stuff and kind of have to, get myself woken up after that as well. But it is important, and it does actually make it so that we can determine what the appropriate names are and avoid confusion. So there are some rules that we need to follow in nomenclature. First of all, what happened? Okay. First of all, species names need to be binomial. And that is the system that was developed by Linnaeus in 1758. And that means that no matter what species you're talking about, whether it's a whale or dolphin or a plant or a bird or a fish or whatever, it's referred to by a two-word scientific name, a genus name and a species name. And these names must be unique. So we want to make sure that we don't have a situation where the same species is known in one country by one scientific name and known in another country by a different one. The common names may be very different from country to country, but the scientific names need to be universal, and that's a big part of why we have this kind of a very strict system in place. Again, as the oldest name is usually the proper choice, not always, but usually, and we should try to strive for stability in most cases. The names themselves, the scientific names, are supposed to be either Latin words or Latinized words, so that's why they sometimes have these very weird sounding names that are very long and difficult to pronounce. And finally, a very important one is no profanity. So you don't want to have a name that has F-U-C-K in it or any other really nasty words. That's something I think just to maintain scientific decency. We kind of want to keep that clean and family oriented. So an example of where we have a sort of a conflict between priority and stability is the bottlenose dolphin, the common bottlenose dolphin, which we all know, of course, as Tursiops truncatus, right? Well, it turns out that when you go back and you look at the history of the taxonomy of bottlenose dolphins, there was a name that was earlier than that actually refers to a bottlenose dolphin, and that is Delphinus tursio. And if you just go strictly by the rules of priority, that is the name that we should be using for the bottlenose dolphin, which means that everybody in this room would start having to call them Delphinus tursio now instead of Tursiops truncatus. And all the books would have to be changed, and everybody's, libraries would have to be changed to that name. Obviously, that would be a major, major problem. So we actually maintain Tursiops truncatus as the common name of the bottlenose dolphin, even though it wasn't the name that has priority, because it's been universally used for over 100 years. And the code actually has this rule in place that allows that to be done in a situation where changing the name would cause a lot of confusion and problems. So an example of a scientific name, just to take a look here, at the common dolphin, Delphinus delphus, which is a name that was listed by Linnaeus in 1758, has a couple of characteristics. Again, it's binomial, so it's a two-word common name. Linnaeus's name is not officially part of the scientific name. It's Latin or Latinized words. The Linnaeus 1758 part of the name doesn't have parentheses around it, which actually has particular meaning. And the name is not allowed to have any punctuation in it. It actually has to be consisting just of Latinized characters. So there are some actually silly common names, scientific names, sorry. Not all scientific names are very, very technical sounding and very, very serious. There's actually no real rules on how you can use a scientific name to honor someone or denote a particular characteristic of the animal. So some of the scientific names that have been used over the past are kind of silly, and I'll give you some examples. There's a species of spider called Heteropoda David Bowie. That's the actual scientific name, and it's a perfectly legitimate scientific name, obviously honoring David Bowie. There's another one called Heteropoda Hippie, and this is one that has very long hair on its legs. There is a lizard, a giant herbivorous lizard called Barbaturex morrisoni, and for those of you that are Doors fans, you'll know that Jim Morrison was the lead singer of the Doors, so obviously the person that named this species was a big fan of the Doors. There's a fly that's considered the all-time diva of flies called Scaptia beyonceae. Self-explanatory. There's a conch named Buffonaria Boris Beckeri, and for those of you that were familiar with tennis, professional tennis in the past, you'll recognize who Boris Becker was. Nothing to do with science, but obviously this person had a affection for professional tennis. There's a carabid beetle that has big biceps, and it's called Agra schwarzeneggeri. This is true. I'm not making this stuff up. There's a darterfish called Ethiostoma Obama, named after President Obama, of course. There is a wasp called Chiroleptus tolkieni, so someone who is obviously a fan of the Lord of the Rings. And to move back to cetaceans again, we have a junior synonym of the killer whale, Delphinus gladiator. I don't think it refers to the Russell Crowe version, but anyways. And then finally, we have a species called Physeter trumpo. And although this was named a long time ago and it's not actually in honor of a certain yellow-haired corrupt politician, I have to say that I really hate this name. I don't like that one at all. Okay, so a little bit about the history and how we got where we are today. There are a number of cetaceans, a little less than 100 cetaceans that are recognized as valid species today. This is Uko's wonderful poster that shows them all here. And if you take a look at the names that have been used over the last couple of centuries for these species, there's actually 613 scientific names that have been used to refer to those 93 species that we currently recognize as valid. So what that means is that only about 15% of the scientific names that have ever been proposed in the past are actually considered to be the proper scientific name for an existing species. And all the rest of those names are some other category. Most of them are what I call junior synonyms, as I mentioned earlier. If you look back at the history of cetacean scientific names, we had a situation where in 1758, Linnaeus introduced our system of nomenclature, and that's where we started our point of taxonomic nomenclature. And at that point, there were only 4 species of currently recognized cetaceans listed. We recognized and discovered more species of cetaceans over the next couple of decades. And we reached a point where in the mid to late 1800s, we had a lot more species recognized than we do today. And that was, partly a result of our incomplete knowledge of cetacean taxonomy. But we got to a point in the late 1800s where we reached a sort of stability, where we have similar numbers of species recognized as we do today, okay? And the thing that really stands out to me most about this graph is that there's 2 bars there in the middle under Gray 1868 and Gray 1871, where there were a lot of species recognized. And I'm going to tell you a little bit in a moment about why that was the case. It's due to a particular characteristic of John Edward Gray, who was an extreme splitter. And a lot of these species were named in the 19th century, in the 1800s, and this was largely because British and French expeditions, and in some cases other countries as well, were sending ships all over the world to collect, to discover foreign lands and make claims on foreign lands. But while they were sailing at sea, they oftentimes collected specimens at sea. And so the number of specimens that were available to taxonomists in the mid-1800s expanded really rapidly because of that. And that's one reason why you see these big peaks in the number of species that were described during that time period. This graph actually shows what Bill Perrin called the Great Victorian Radiation. where during the mid-1800s, from about 1820 to about the 1870s, there were large peaks in the number of species that were described. And again, it's because of all those specimens that were coming in from all those far-flung expeditions around the world. So again, we started in 1758 with just a small number of species, a lot of species discovered in the 1800s. Those peaks, all those peaks there correspond with publications by John Edward Gray. And although new species have continued to be discovered in the 1900s and even in the current millennium, the number of species that have been discovered recently is much smaller. And a lot of that's just because we've found pretty much everything up until this point. And we're just now at the point of sometimes deciding that a border needs to be put in place between what we thought was one species before that now is two species. So we're still discovering new species, but it's coming at a much slower rate. And most species that are described are no longer valid, as I showed you in that earlier graph. So I mentioned John Edward Gray. He's the guy responsible for all these peaks. And if you look at the number of species that were described by a particular biologist in the past and list them out by author, what you find for the delphinoids, which is the dolphins and the porpoises, as well as for the beaked and sperm whales, John Edward Gray described more species than any other biologist by far. So that peak in the first column of the graph there corresponds to Gray's species that he described. And he's recognized today, and he was recognized even in his time as an extreme splitter who kind of didn't see nature the same way that other people did. And a colleague of his, William Henry Flower, in 1884, he described John Edward Gray in a publication in the following way. Unfortunately, his tendency to multiply divisions and impose names almost at random, his want of accuracy in description, and his defective anatomical knowledge are exhibited in his writings in this group in their fullest development. Individual peculiarities, such as are the effects of immaturity or of accidental mutilation, or of mistaken impressions gathered from imperfect photographic representations, are made the foundations of generic distinctions which are maintained in successive catalogs and lists, notwithstanding the exposure of the errors upon which they were based. Specimens between which no one else finds any specific distinction are placed in different genera. Well, besides being a run-on sentence, that's a pretty amazing statement for a gentleman biologist of the 1800s, because we think of those guys back then as being very, 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 very gentlemanly and having a lot of honor and not really criticizing their colleagues. But Gray was such an extreme case that his colleague Flower felt this need to criticize him, although I noticed he did it after Gray died. So he probably figured at least I won't have any blowback from that one. But anyways, it was a pretty extreme statement, but I think it's true. We recognize today Gray was really, really extreme in how he would split species. Anything that basically was slightly different from a species that was known at the time, he thought, oh, that's got to be a new species. And of course, the nice thing about it is he got to then put his name on it. So it was a little bit of a self-serving thing as well. So taxonomy is done by people, and people are flawed. They're not all perfect, for sure. We think we know that. And I just want to say a little bit about some of the other personalities in the field of early taxonomy who were very influential. You've already heard me mention Carl Linnaeus several times. So he is the Swedish botanist and physician who actually dabbled in all aspects of biology, including taxonomy. And he is the guy that actually developed the current binomial system of zoological nomenclature. So we owe him for that. I'm sure you all learned that in basic biology. He wrote many important biological works besides the Systema Naturae, where he provided all this biological nomenclature information. And his 10th edition is the one that actually marks the starting point of our taxonomic nomenclature that we use starting in 1758. So names published before 1758, and there were scientific names published before that time, have no taxonomic standing in nomenclature. They can't be used in nomenclature, and they don't really exist for the purposes of nomenclature. So a couple more influential people. You've already heard me mention John Edward Gray, British biologist. He, despite the fact that he did have flaws and he did provide a lot of names that we don't recognize as valid anymore, he did have a very, very huge influence in cetacean taxonomy and taxonomy of many other creatures. But he was also quite sloppy, and his publications are full of many errors. In addition, he was quite ornery and not well liked by his colleagues, something that probably, of course, today we're all very honorable and everybody loves each other and we praise each other and nobody ever criticizes anybody. But back then, you know, it was a little different story, I guess. But he did name more cetacean species than any other person. And so we owe a debt of gratitude to him for all the work that he did, despite his imperfections. Another gentleman, an American named Edward Drinker Cope, was very, very well respected at the time, biologist. He was a cetacean taxonomist, but he also did a lot of paleontology work on dinosaurs, fossil mammals, and everything else, but also a very flawed gentleman. He named a large number of species, but he was also an extreme racist, and he published several papers and books about his theories about the inferiority of other races other than the white race. He was very sexist, blatantly so, and he apparently died from syphilis that may have been contracted from his many extramarital affairs. So although he did a lot for science, in other ways he was not such a great guy. All right, some recent and upcoming clarifications of taxonomy that we need to talk about. First of all, the sperm whales. Many of you younger folks here may not remember this, but back in the 70s and 80s, there was a big controversy about what the proper, valid scientific name to use for the sperm whale is. Because we had recognized for a long time that there's just one global species of sperm whale around the world, right? In all the oceans, we just have one. But the important thing is, what name do we use for it? And this arises because when sperm whales were first described by Linnaeus, he actually described them as 4 different species, and he gave 4 different names for the sperm whale. 2 of those names kind of were immediately sort of dismissed as not really being relevant to being the proper name for the sperm whale, but the other 2, Physeter macrocephalus and Physeter catodon, were both kind of in contention, and had both been used in the past as the legitimate scientific name for the sperm whale. And so in the 70s and 60s, 70s, and early 80s, there was a big controversy in our field about which name should be used. And again, it dates back to Linnaeus. And the reason is because these 4 names that he proposed in 1758, they were proposed right next to each other in the same publication. And that means that none of those names has priority. So we can't use the usual rule of saying, you know, what's the oldest name for the sperm whale? Because there are 4 names that all age from the same point. So that didn't work. None of those names really had precedence. And what that meant was we had to decide then which of those names are the proper name to use and look at the different rules of nomenclature as to why we should choose a particular name over the other one. Now, some scientists, including a guy named Bill Cheville, who many of you know, who was a very prominent marine mammal biologist, he thought that the name Physeter catodon actually was being used by Linnaeus to refer to another species of whale, maybe pilot whales. And this stems from the fact that the descriptions that Linnaeus wrote were very, very brief and very general. So he didn't really provide the kind of descriptions that we would provide today to describe a species. The wording, well, first of all, was in Latin, so you had to decipher the Latin. And second of all, it was very, very difficult to discern the specific characters that he was talking about. A lot of them were just kind of general cetacean characters that really couldn't be used to denote a particular species. So that led to this controversy. And what that meant is that the way that we deal with situations like this is there's a principle called the first reviser. And that means that the first person who publishes a paper after a situation like this and clearly denotes that one of those available names has priority as the proper name for the species is the one who actually gets credit for naming that species. Not naming the species, but denoting the proper name. Okay? There was still a lot of controversy about what the first reviser was for many, many years, and it went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and finally it has been determined that in 1847, a guy named Wagner, a German biologist, clearly indicated that Physeter macrocephalus was the name to be used for the sperm whale, and that now stands as the relevant name for the sperm whale. So the controversy has been kind of settled, but it was a big controversy for many, many years. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a case study about the humpback dolphins, which is a genus very near and dear to my heart, that had really had a very confused taxonomy until fairly recently. Many different species of humpback dolphins had been described, starting from the early 1800s onwards. And the taxonomy of the genus was pretty confused, but until about 8 years ago, we only really recognized 2 species of humpback dolphins, even though we knew that they had a lot of variation in their taxonomy, in their morphology and their appearance. We recognized the Atlantic humpback dolphin found off of West Africa, Susa tutsii, and the Indo-Pacific humpback dolphin, Susa chinensis, which had a very wide range extending all the way from southern Africa all the way through to Australia and China. And in 2014, a new arrangement of Susa was proposed that split them into 4 species. The Atlantic humpback dolphin on the top there, the Indian Ocean humpback dolphin, Susa plumbea, was resurrected as a species that had been named back in 1829 but hadn't been considered legitimate or valid. It was shown that that is in fact a valid species. Susa chinensis was restricted to just the animals in Southeast Asia. And a new species, the Australian humpback dolphin, Susa sahelensis, was proposed. And that taxonomy was accepted by the Marine Mammal Society. And it had some important consequences for conservation because before that taxonomic revision was accepted, these 2 species of humpback dolphins were listed on the IUCN Red List as vulnerable and near threatened. So they were kind of in relatively lower risk categories of extinction. And it really wasn't considered that humpback dolphins anywhere in the world were really in grave risk of extinction in terms of any taxonomic groupings. But after the new system was established and assessments of their red list status were done, these 4 species were listed as critically endangered for the Atlantic humpback dolphin, endangered for the Indian Ocean humpback dolphin, and vulnerable for the 2 other species. And so what that meant is it resulted in increased conservation emphasis for these 4 species and hopefully resulted in better prospects for their conservation and protection. Now, there's also some reason to believe that there might be a fifth species of humpback dolphin. There's a genetically distinct and somewhat morphologically distinct form of humpback dolphin that occurs in the Bay of Bengal, off eastern India and in Asian waters. And there is a scientific name that was proposed in the 1800s, Susa lentigginosa, that may actually apply to that form. But there still needs to be some work done to determine whether or not it in fact is a valid species. So stay tuned for further details on that as science comes in. Now, there are some other important changes on the horizon in marine mammal taxonomy that'll probably be happening in the next couple of years. The advent of molecular genetic work has really resulted in an incredible amount of new information and a lot of new data for us to be able to make taxonomic decisions. Before molecular genetics were available, we were pretty much limited to skulls and other bones for doing taxonomy. And skulls and bones are very hard to come by, and they're very expensive to prepare, and they take, especially blue whale skulls and fin whale skulls, they take up a huge amount of room in museums. So we didn't really have a lot of material to look at cetacean taxonomy. But with the advent of molecular taxonomy, we have suddenly multitudes of information available. You can now get a little biopsy sample from a dolphin or a whale, or you can even get eDNA by scooping up with a net the DNA that's in the water after a whale swims by or poops in the water. And so we have a lot more data to be able to do taxonomic work now. And so that's resulted in a real huge influx in information on taxonomy of these animals and a lot of taxonomic changes that have happened and are about to happen. Several new species have been discovered recently based largely on molecular differences, but it's interesting to note that once the genetic data indicates that there's a particular species boundary there, when you go back and look at the morphological data and the coloration data and things like that, very often we see that there are in fact differences there that we just didn't really pay attention to before. So that's one of the interesting things about genetics that's really kind of brought things to a new point in our understanding. And in addition, some species have been lumped back in together with other species, even though they were listed as a separate species previously, and that's been based on, usually on genetic information, but sometimes on morphology. So it goes both ways. And things that are kind of in the works, splitting of killer whales and bottlenose dolphins are forthcoming, and rearrangements of several dolphin genera, including Lagonorhynchus and Stenella, will also likely be happening in the next, 5 years, maybe 10 years, something like that. So with the coming changes in cetacean taxonomy, there's going to be similar splits and changes in taxonomy and other groupings as well. For instance, we currently list a single species of globally distributed killer whale around the world with an IUCN status of data deficient. I think a lot of people have questions as to whether or not that's really true. And there's mounting evidence that killer whales will likely be split into a couple of different species quite soon in the future based on a number of different pieces of information. And this pattern is going to be likely repeated with many different species as well. So let's take a few of the specific examples. The tropical dolphin Stenella species that Bill Perrin had spent a lot of time studying and helped clarify the taxonomy of. There are currently 5 species listed in the genus, shown here in this somewhat abstract painting. I should have used one of Uko's paintings here, or drawings here, but anyways, this is the one that I could find relatively quickly that shows all of them together. The spinner and striped dolphins actually may be more closely related to common dolphins than they are to the spotted dolphins. So that, if that in fact is shown to be the case with further data, that will require a splitting up of this genus Stenella because, again, the taxonomy needs to be based on phylogenetic relationships. The Clymene dolphin apparently represents a hybrid species between the striped dolphin and the spinner dolphin, which is very interesting because that's something that has been considered to be very, very rare in the animal kingdom and completely unknown in cetaceans until recently. So that's pretty exciting discovery. And the spotted dolphins, the 2 spotted dolphins on the bottom there, actually may be more closely related to bottlenose dolphins. But no changes have been made in the genus taxonomy recently because we need further information. There's a lot of studies that have been done, and the results of those studies don't necessarily come to a very clear consensus on how we should split the genus. But I think pretty much everybody involved in cetacean taxonomy realizes that the genus Stenella is not a natural grouping, and it's going to have to be split at some point in the future. But we just need a little bit more information to figure out how we should split it properly to make sure we do it right. Next one is common dolphins, and here we're in San Diego now, of course, and here in the Eastern Pacific, there's been a lot of controversy about the status of the long-beak common dolphin that occurs off our coast here. In fact, I think you guys that went out on the boat yesterday saw some on your boat trip. I didn't get a chance to go out there, so I missed it, but the short and long-beak common dolphins in the Eastern Pacific here have been recognized as separate entities of some sort for over a century. Either separate species, separate subspecies, separate populations. The taxonomies flip-flop back and forth many times, going from one to the other. Currently, the 2 forms are considered separate subspecies of the same species, but until a couple of years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, they were actually considered to be separate species. So recently, 5, 6 years ago, they were downgraded to subspecies. And this is a controversial move. So a soon-to-be-published study has shown, I think, pretty clearly that there are diagnostic differences in skull morphology and coloration of the short and long-beak common dolphins here in the Eastern Pacific. There are also genetic differences and differences in their ecology and life history, including differences in the timing of when they breed and things like that. So this information taken together concludes that these short and long-beak common dolphins in the Eastern Pacific are, in fact, closely related but distinct species. And a final decision about whether or not to accept them as separate species needs to rest with the Society for Marine Mammalogy Taxonomy Committee. So that hopefully will be happening in the next year or 2, something like that. And then finally, killer whales. Again, we currently recognize a single species of killer whales around the world, Orcinus orca. That's been controversial for several decades, actually. There's recent support for the idea of what I call sort of cultural evolution, a kind of a form of cultural evolution, a different way of speciation. We used to think that speciation only occurred by having some kind of a geographical separation of 2 populations of the same species, that for some reason, a geographical barrier of some sort prevented them from interbreeding, and then they would evolve into separate species. And in fact, that's how it happens a lot of times. But we're now recognizing that that's not the only way it can happen. Species can actually come about by other means as well. And in the case of killer whales, it seems to be that the 2 different forms of killer whales that occur in the Pacific Northwest, at least along shore, the resident and Biggs killer whales, have evolved different cultures. And those different cultures have resulted in those 2 forms maintaining separation and not interbreeding. And that appears to have resulted in actual speciation, evolutionary speciation. So that's been kind of a theory that's been around for many years. It's being tested right now, and in fact, we're finding some good evidence that in fact is actually true. So it's likely that there will be description of several species of killer whales in the coming years. And the most important one I think that's going to happen very soon is the splitting out of the resident and Biggs killer whales in the Eastern Pacific here as separate species. That's something that's in the works, and you'll be hearing more about, I'm sure, very soon. So I'm going to conclude here with a few concluding remarks before we get to our riddle. So again, get your thinking caps out. I hope I've convinced you that taxonomy is important. What at first might seem to be quite boring and dull actually has sort of a fascinating history, I think at least. Those of you that are awake will hopefully agree with me. Some of the people that have been involved in cetacean taxonomy in the past have very interesting, if somewhat not always illustrious past. And there are some very, very interesting personalities involved that have resulted in the taxonomy that we see today. It's very true, I think, that taxonomy and nomenclature actually represent the most basic element of our understanding of biological diversity. So it's really critical that we have a proper taxonomy and proper separation into species and other taxonomic groups in order for us to do any of the other work that we do. In order for us to really even go out and study the animal's behavior or acoustics or ecology, we really have to know what species are distinct from other species. It's really, really a basic element of that. Pretty clearly, I think to understand nature, we first of all have to know how to organize it. And even though we have to recognize that our classifications and our distinctions that we develop are in somewhat they're human constructs. They're not necessarily always 100% fully real divisions that all the animals out there recognize. We do have hybrids. We do have introgression of DNA from one species into another species. So they're not always reading the textbooks and agreeing with us that these species are completely distinct and don't interbreed. But for the most part, that is the way that biology works. We do have species out there that are largely maintaining separate gene pools, and it's important for us to understand that for pretty much everything we do with these animals. And of course, again, as I mentioned earlier, modern taxonomy reflects evolutionary history, and so our discovery of the evolutionary history of the animals, both from taxonomic studies and from fossil studies and other paleontological work, kind of feeds into our taxonomy and becomes sort of an interactive thing where we need to kind of take those two pieces of information together and integrate them into our understanding of the real world out there. And of course, we can't save a species from extinction unless we know where those species boundaries are. We'll never really be able to do that unless we have proper taxonomies that recognize real and proper species boundaries. Okay, so it's riddle time. All right, so are you still awake out there? Some of you? Okay. All right, so I've got a riddle for you. Are you ready? Okay. There were 30 killer whales and 28 Dall's porpoises. How many didn't? I'll give you a minute to think about it. If anybody knows the answer, just shout it out.
Can you restate the question?
Okay. There were 30 killer whales and 28 Dall's porpoises. How many didn't? I heard 2. I heard someone else? 10? Who said 10? Ah, very smart. You got it. Does anybody know why Michelle got 10? Okay. All right, well, let's move on. Maybe this will help you. So she's right. The answer is 10. By the way, I got it wrong the first time I heard this as well. It's a tricky one. But seeing it written out will help you, I think. Okay, here we go. There were 30 killer whales and 28 Dall's porpoises. How many didn't? Okay. The answer is 10. All right. I figured I'd better wake people up at the end. And before I conclude, just two more quick things. I want to say, first of all, happy birthday to my good friend and my colleague, Tom Kiekefer, over here. Today is Tom's birthday. We wish him a happy birthday. Happy birthday, Tom. And one more thing also, as Uko mentioned, the Viva Vaquita booth, we have tons and tons of marine mammal books there. If you have even the slightest interest in, other than just PDFs, in actual books where you can hold it in your hand and read it in front of a fireplace, you want to come over and check out the Viva Vaquita booth in Point Loma number 1? Yep. Point Loma number 1, which is basically the room just over here. And check out the books. We've got prices on them, little dots on each book with a price code. They're priced to sell, and all of the money, 100% of the money goes into vaquita conservation for Viva Vaquita work. So it's for a good cause. And my hope is to go back home today with no books to take home and drag home with me. So come on over there, buy lots of books, and have fun reading actual books. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. That was incredible. Really, really good talk. I'm going to open the floor for some questions. I think I saw Bonnie, actually, Gretz there at the beginning. In the middle, saw her hand go up a little bit before everyone else. Then I'll go on to, I think Phil, then Phil. I think Phil after number 2. I think Phil. Sorry, I feel like an auctioneer here right now.
Right here, $5.
Go ahead, Bonnie.
Okay, so my question is about hybrids, and is there ever any chance that they will evolve into a separate species? Some of the common sense about them is that maybe they don't reproduce very well, or if they do, their offspring don't live very long, that kind of thing. So curious about that.
Yeah, that I remember when I was a young student probably in junior high school and high school biology. I remember people talking about hybrids and saying, well, there are these hybrids that exist, but they're infertile, So they're these weird freaks of nature that can't breed on their own, and so they're just these strange things that happen sometimes when the system goes wrong and it's not part of the normal biological pattern or cycle. And I think our understanding of biology now, and of cetacean biology in particular, has shown us that that's not really true. Hybrids occur probably quite commonly, a lot more commonly than we recognize. And I had a really interesting experience right as COVID was starting to close down the world. I was on a boat in Baja, and we were out looking at a mixed feeding group of fin and blue whales. And one whale popped up near the boat, and we all looked at it and went, that's weird. What is it? Looks like a fin whale, but it fluked up. And fin whales don't really normally fluke up. And it had some weird modeling on it, and its right lower jaw didn't seem to be very light in color. And we kind of scratched our heads and that kind of thing. And finally we said, you know what, maybe it's a hybrid fin blue whale. And it turned out, in fact, that's what it was. It turned out it was an animal that had actually been seen previously and biopsied and even tracked by satellite and confirmed as a hybrid through the biopsy sample. And it's now been seen many, many different times. But I wonder how often, when people are out on whale watching trips and even on scientific research expeditions and they see something strange that doesn't really seem to fit into, what they expect a particular species to look like, that maybe they're seeing, in many cases, they're seeing a hybrid animal. So I think they're actually fairly common out there. And like I said, for the Clymene dolphin, we do believe that the current theory is that the Clymene dolphin did evolve as a sort of a hybrid swarm between spinner dolphins and striped dolphins in the Atlantic Ocean. There's some good evidence to suggest that. So hybrids, I think they do occur. And if the Clymene dolphin example is in fact accurate, then it does indicate that it is a probably uncommon, but certainly a real way that a species can come about. So I think we have to recognize that that's an important thing. Yeah, good question. Thanks.
Phil, I guess.
Yeah, that was a lovely talk. Thank you very much. I do have a trivia question for you, actually, Tom.
Oh, okay. A riddle?
So, as you said, Linnaeus produced 10 editions of Systema Naturae, and the 10th edition is the one that everything you talked about is based on.
Yeah.
In which one of those 10 editions did Linnaeus decide that whales were mammals and not fish?
Ooh, good question. I don't know if I know the answer for sure, but I think it was something like the 8th edition?
No, it was the 10th, actually.
It was the 10th. That was the first one. Okay.
So Jim Mead and I was sitting around having coffee at Smithsonian when I was at the National Museum years ago, and we raised this, and I raised this question, like which edition was it?
Yeah.
So there's not many places where you can immediately resolve this, but Smithsonian is one of them. So we wandered down to the Dibner Library, which is the rare book library, went to Leslie Overstreet, who's the wonderful librarian there, and said, do you have a first edition of Systema Naturae? And she said, yes, of course. So they went into the locked, the vault, came out with the first edition, and no, whales are fish. So we went, okay, what about the second edition? She said, yes, of course. And she went in and pulled, and so we worked our way through the first 4 editions, all of which they have in the Dibner Library, and then went, okay, what about the 9th? And we went to the 9th. There's still fish in the 9th. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't know that. I thought it was a little bit earlier that Linnaeus actually finally split them out as mammals instead of fish. But that just shows you how recent our understanding of these animals, really is. I mean, until that point, 1758, the official classification of whales was still as fish. And in fact, many of the whalers in the 1800s actually, and probably some whalers today, still really consider them fish. They don't really think the distinction that we, scientists use to distinguish them as mammals are really very important. They think, well, fish swim in the ocean, with fins, and, whales and dolphins have fins and swim in the ocean, so thus they're fish. So it's, it's a different way of taxonomy. So our scientific taxonomy and nomenclature is what we use and what we hope that everybody will use, but not everybody follows that. People have their own ideas and taxonomies sometimes.
I believe that actually Mathurin Jacques Brisson was the first one to yank them away out of the whole fishy world.
Yeah.
In 1756, and then Linnaeus inspired got going on his 10th edition. And
right.
I think then
right.
Brisson complained.
And I think it's important to recognize that Linnaeus actually probably never saw, he certainly never saw a sperm whale. So the sperm whale controversy that I talked about, he started that all, but he was actually using information from other publications for describing the 4 species of sperm whales that he had in his 1758 edition. And it's probably true, Linnaeus wasn't a marine biologist. He was actually primarily a botanist and a physician. So he did spend some time at sea, of course, in his travels, and he might have seen dolphins, at sea, and maybe a whale or two, but he didn't really have much direct experience with cetaceans or with a lot of the animals that he published in his various editions of Systema Naturae. But he was the guy who pulled all that information together, and again, he was the one who proposed the system of nomenclature that we found today, where we only have to use 2 of those crazy-sounding names. Looking back at some of the scientific names that existed before Linnaeus's 1758 edition, what people would do is as they would come up with ideas of new species, they would take existing species names and just add long Latinized words onto the end of it. So you'd get some species names where there were 5 or 6 words or 7 or 8 words, and each word had 27 letters. And I mean, they would take up several lines in a book just to list out one species name. And so I think Linnaeus really did us a huge and great service by actually simplifying it to just 2 crazy-sounding names. Yeah.
We're going to possibly break almost, but I'm going to allow, because we're still at an hour and a half, so I'll allow for maybe a few questions, and then we'll go for a lunch break. I think there's someone, I think, in the back there, or I'm not sure. To be honest, I'm so sorry. I'm not sure who
was first.
Yeah.
We got to use the principle of priority here.
Hey. Thanks, Tom. I enjoyed your talk. I have a quick question. Wow, I'm really loud. I think you really point out how the naming of names is important. And, harkening back to Michelle's discussion earlier about our sort of anthropomorphism, anthropocentrism, a lot of this naming of names it's kind of about us.
Yeah.
But it's also a way that we make conservation priorities. And I noticed that you stayed away a little bit from designations below the species level. What is a subspecies? What is a discrete population?
Right.
But these have consequences, as you point out. And I think about, I did my Ph.D. work with dusky dolphins. At that time, they were one species. Yeah, there were some population differences. We called them data deficient. And now I believe there are, I just checked, 4 subspecies recognized with different designations. Similarly, with the Hector's dolphin, the naming of the Maui's dolphin subspecies gave a new sense of urgency to their conservation. Right. It seems to me that this could be applied much more broadly. For example, right here locally, our coastal California bottlenose dolphin population perhaps warrants further concern, as it's a small number of animals. Can you talk a little bit more about how we make these distinctions and decisions that can affect conservation and management?
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks. I specifically avoided the issue of going too much below the level of species, because first of all, species taxonomy, alpha taxonomy, is kind of the one that pretty much everybody deals with on a regular basis. Not every species has recognized subspecies within it, although most species do have at least geographical populations, and many of those might eventually be classified as subspecies. But it does get into a bit more of a tangled mess. But you're right also that it's important to go there, because it is important for conservation. And we used to think that just preserving species was enough, but of course now we recognize that that's not enough. Obviously, we do need to preserve species, but we also need to preserve every unit of genetic diversity that exists, and that goes all the way down to the population level. How you actually go about this, the process of actually classifying those and naming those. Of course, subspecies do get names. Geographical populations don't get scientific names. Obviously, we need to denote them some way by a common name, but we only go down to the level of subspecies for the use of scientific names. And of course, that's a situation where we go beyond Linnaeus's binomial system and use a trinomial system, where we have a third name that denotes the subspecies, like Delphinus, Delphis bairdii, something like that. So the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature actually does deal with subspecies, and it uses largely the same rules, or the same basic types of rules for subspecies designation as for species designation. Of course, it's a little bit less strict than the species designation. So it covers basically everything from family level down to subspecies level. And so there is a set of rules in place for naming subspecies as well. And we have to be similarly concerned about how to do it properly, and the principle of priority and the issue of stability and that kind of thing applies to subspecies just the same way it does to species. Whether or not there will actually ever be a day when we actually apply a quadrinomial system with 4 names to taxa below subspecies level, I don't know. I kind of doubt it, but it's possible. It might happen someday. But yeah, I think you brought up a very good point that species taxonomy is important for conservation, but obviously we need to be much more concerned as well about the levels below species, because we need to preserve all that genetic diversity. Yeah, thanks.
Right now, so we're eating into our lunchtime. Maybe just one quick question, if we can do that. And then we'll break for lunch. Right? No? Was it Barb? Oh.
I'm wondering if politics or personality are ever involved in the actual names that you come up with.
Oh, never. They're not really involved in anything. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, like I said, personality. John Edward Gray's personality was just a guy who he wanted to. I think he wanted to publish a lot, and he did. He published 1,035 papers in his scientific career, which is a pretty amazing record. And I think probably, by all accounts, he had a big ego. And I think the fact that he was naming all these things as separate species that nobody else saw as anything different from what was already known, but that allowed him to name a lot of species and get his name on a lot of species. I think that was probably a big part of his motivation. But I also think he saw it as scientifically valid. Gray was not, he was a contemporary of Darwin. They knew each other quite well. They were both associated with the British Museum and saw each other at meetings of the Zoological Society of London. And when Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859, Gray was one of the minority of biologists who basically rejected it. He not only rejected, some biologists accepted, Darwin's theory that species evolve, but they didn't necessarily accept his mechanism of natural selection. Gray rejected the whole thing. He was very religious, and he didn't accept the idea that species evolved. And I think that was a big part of why he did things the way he did, because he couldn't bring himself to believe that a species could evolve and change. He thought that all the species were placed here on Earth by God. in that form, and that's the form that they were always in. And so I think that's one of the reasons why he saw everything that seemed a little bit different from something that was known as a separate species, rather than what we now know it could have been just an offshoot of the other species that was in the process of evolving into a new species. So I think Gray is a really good example of how personality really affected his taxonomic decisions. And there's other examples as well too, but he's the one that really stands out to me, I think.
Okay, I think we are going to, of course, again, Tom will be just behind this wall here, available at the Viva Vaquita booth. We're going to be breaking for lunch, making sure that we're all reconvening. It will give us plenty of time here at 2:15, so I'm going to ask you to be back to reconvene to make sure that we're back here at 2:15. I'm sorry. I need new glasses. I'm sorry, 1:15. I'll give us also really a big break there, didn't I? Okay, thank you, Tom.
Thanks, okay. Thank you.